I want to talk about a specific aspect of the Spanish Empire. I'm going to start off by saying that when the Spanish came, as I already mentioned to you, they didn't come um, because of their sense of adventure. They came because they wanted to make money. And the people who came to America, uh, were the adventurers. Most of them didn't come to America because they wanted to live way out in the middle of nowhere, a little house in the prairie, right? Most of them came because they wanted to exploit the land, get as much wealth as they could, and go back to Spain where they could live like hidalgos. Hidalgos, right? Hidalgo is hijos de algo, right? Son of something, right? Big shots, essentially, right? Hijos hidalgos. The optimum situation for them would have been to find, El Dorado, big pile of gold, grab the gold and go back, right? They couldn't do that, so they realized eventually that they were going to have to exploit the land, especially in the Caribbean, as I mentioned, because it was a subsistence economy. They actually tried to enslave the natives in the Caribbean, but the natives didn't survive. They weren't good slaves, and they didn't survive. So they would have to replace that later, and we'll talk about that on a different day. But the point is that what ends up happening is that the people who came to conquer America and to extract the value did it because they wanted to make money. Okay. And so what ends up happening is that rather than being able to divide up a bunch of uh, gold that they were able to steal, instead they actually ended up dividing the land. And what they divided the land into was called encomiendas, right? Now, we'll just say it that there's actually two different words for that in Spanish, the encomienda and the repartimiento, but mostly it's called the encomienda system, we'll call it that. And the encomienda system is very much like the feudal system. Um, I don't know if you remember the drawing that I made. Let me see if I can do it here. The drawing that I made of the feudal system in Europe was that there was an area of land that we would call the fief, and on the land there was a manor where the Lord lived, and then there was a village, and there were fields of the Lord, and there were commons, right? And the encomienda system is going to be similar to this, because in what will happen is that essentially the king still owns all of the land, but he's going to allow an encomendero to use the land, and his use of the land is going to be to profit from the work of the campesinos, or the indios, right? All right. So instead of peasants, we have indios. Instead of lords, we have encomenderos, right? The the theory was that just like in Europe, the indios could use the land, and they could um, uh, support themselves on the land as long as they paid labor to the encomendero, right? And then in return for that, the encomendero was supposed to provide protection and Christian indoctrination. Um, the reality was the reality was that the source of income that the encomendero was going to get came from the labor of the indios. What's the problem with that? What's happening to the indios?
They were dying.
They were dying. What were they dying of?
Disease.
They were dying of diseases, right? And so what we see happening with the encomienda system is that the source of income for the encomendero is small and decreasing. And then once the Indios have all died, there won't be any more profit. And so what the response of the encomenderos is to work the Indios as hard as they can so that they can produce as much as they possibly can, um, in order to give the encomendero as much profit as he can get, because once they're dead, that's the end of the profit, and hopefully he'll have enough to go back to Spain and live like an hidalgo. Okay, so what ends up happening then is that the encomenderos are working the Indians hard because they're dying. But what's going to happen is that there's going to be a um, a priest. His name is Bartolome de las Casas here, because and what Las Casas will argue is that the encomenderos are working the Indians to death, right? Now, that's not exactly correct, because the Indians were dying, but not because they were being worked to death, but because of disease, right? But nevertheless, they were dying, all right? So it doesn't make it any better for the encomenderos, who were just using them for profit, right? But the main thing is that Bartolome de las Casas will publicize what's going on with the Indians in Europe in a book that he wrote, which in English we call The Destruction of the Indies, is going to portray the encomenderos as brutal beasts who are exploiting the Indians. It was illustrated with these, I forgot what they call these things, linotypes or something like that. But at any rate, the point is, you can see here, they're cutting off the Indians' hands, and they're running around bleeding and things like that. Now, this is not as it wasn't as bad as this, although it was bad, right? But at any rate, the point here is that that developed what's called the Black Legend, right? The Black Legend is that the uh, Spanish came to America, they recruited and killed the Indians and stole all their stuff, right? And so the Black Legend then will be associated with Spanish colonization in America from then on. The rest of the Europeans will look and say, "Oh, look what the Spanish did in Spanish America," ignoring the fact that the French and the British do the same things in North America based on the economics, right? So we'll see, for example, that the British come to North America and eventually drive off all the natives, because the natives are living in subsistence economies and they can't make any money that way. So they drive the natives off the land so they can make money from the land, okay? That's not different from what the Spanish did, okay? So the Spanish weren't any more or less brutal than any of the other Europeans, okay? It's just that their brutality was more highly publicized. Okay, all right, so now what happens is that this guy, Bartolome de las Casas, gets the attention of the King of Spain. And the King of Spain is going to say that these new people in the Americas are my subjects and they need to be protected. Okay, that's what Las Casas is going to argue. So there's going to be a great debate in a place called Valladolid in Spain, right? Let me go ahead and write that here. Valladolid. I'm sorry. You're going to actually see this in a video that you'll see later on, Valladolid. But the video is BBC video, so they mispronounce everything. At any rate, Valladolid in Spain, and the debate will be between Las Casas and another guy named Juan Gines de Sepulveda, who the British call Sepulveda, right? But at any rate, if you were going to actually write this, there would be an accent over the U, okay? At any rate, Juan Gines de Sepulveda, all right? So what Las Casas argues is that the natives are rational human beings who deserve the king's protection. And what Sepulveda will argue is that the natives are less than human, not fully human, but they can be educated, they can be made human, educated into humanity, and the price of that education is labor. So on the one hand, Las Casas sees this vast group of people who are being exploited and saying that we don't have a right to exploit them because they're rational human beings who deserve the king's protection. They're just like us. And we see then Sepulveda arguing against that by saying, well, they're not quite human. Actually, they're not the same color as us. And not only that, but they aren't civilized like us. And so we can teach them, to be civilized, but they have to pay a price for that. And the price is going to be their labor. So on the one hand, we have this kind of condemnation of the encomienda system. And on the other hand, we have a argument in favor of it. Okay. And what's really interesting about this is that this is the first debate in world history on the issue of human rights. Who's human and who has rights? It happens first in the Spanish Empire. And what the king will decide is that Las Casas is right, that Las Casas, that the natives are rational human beings and they do deserve the king's protection. And so what will happen is that the king will outlaw the encomienda. Now, it's outlawed in 1542, and there are still encomiendas in the 18th century. And the reason for that is because the application of law in the Spanish Empire was slow, often very slow, right? But the main thing is that in theory, what ends up happening is that the rule of the Indians, the rule of the Americas, goes out of the hands of the conquistadores and into the hands of bureaucrats. And what will happen then is that the Spanish Empire will be divided into viceroyalties, where the viceroys actually act in the name of the king, and then that will be divided into other areas, geographical areas, that will eventually end up pretty much following the division of Spanish America into the countries that it is now, and even, for example, in Mexico, of where the states are, right? But it comes under the rule of the Spanish, right? So that's going to essentially be the Spanish Empire, and it won't really change very much for the next 300 years. Okay, we'll talk later in our course about how the empire comes to an end and what the effect of that is going to be on the United States. But for now, we just want to conclude, I guess you could say, that all of the authority in the Spanish Empire will rest in the king. And the reason why that's important is because if the king is wise, like King Philip was when he called this this debate, then the empire is ruled wisely. But if the king's an idiot, which happens, then the empire is ruled idiotically. All right, and that's going to be the weakness of the Spanish Empire, and eventually it will come to an end.